Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today, we're unearthing one of history's most compelling and, well, often misunderstood periods,
Yeah.
the French Revolution. For many, it conjures images of liberty and enlightenment, right? A glorious fight for human rights.
Absolutely. That's the popular image.
But as we peel back the layers of our sources, a starker, more brutal reality emerges. This was also a decade saturated in violence, a relentless struggle that fundamentally reshaped French society.
It really was.
Our mission for you in this deep dive is to truly grasp how violence became not just a feature, but a defining characteristic of this era. What did it mean to be an assassin in such a chaotic, ideologically charged environment?
That term gets really stretched.
Exactly. We've sifted through a rich collection of articles, academic research, and compelling historical accounts. Together, we're going to distill the most vital insights, helping you navigate this complex, often terrifying landscape. So let's dive in.
And that's precisely the critical lens we need to adopt. Violence, as these historical accounts strikingly reveal, was far from being a mere backdrop or, an unfortunate side effect of the revolution.
Right.
It was, as one scholar aptly puts it, a fundamental factor, not an actor, in history. This nuanced framing suggests that violence wasn't an independent agent with its own will, but rather an underlying pervasive force.
A factor, not an actor. I like that.
It propelled the revolution forward through every stage, from the initial popular uprisings to the chilling state-sanctioned purges. What we see is a relentless, almost terrifying dynamic feedback loop.
A feedback loop. How so?
Well, where each act of force, whether spontaneous or calculated, seemed to beget further, more extreme violence, continually accelerating radicalization and reshaping the very fabric of French society.
Okay, I see. Force begets more force.
Precisely. So this deep dive is about moving beyond a purely ideological or political interpretation, important as those are. It's about focusing on the raw, often chaotic, and deeply human element of force as a primary engine of historical change.
Raw and human. Yep.
We're going to examine how that force manifested, how it evolved from the streets to the state, and how it was ultimately institutionalized. Understanding the French Revolution in its truest sense means confronting its inherent and profoundly transformative violence, recognizing it as a driving engine rather than just a tragic consequence.
That's a powerful and essential distinction. It immediately makes us reconsider our typical understanding of an assassin. When that word comes to mind, we often picture a lone, shadowy figure, right, operating in secret.
A classic image, yeah.
But the revolutionary period in Paris completely blurred those lines, creating a much more complex picture. Our sources provide three crucial distinctions that truly help us make sense of this chaotic and bloody context.
It's helpful to break it down.
Definitely. First, we had individual assassinations. These were indeed deliberate, targeted killings carried out by individuals or small, often ideologically driven groups against specific political figures.
Like Corday and Marat.
Exactly. The most famous example, which we'll explore in detail, is Charlotte Corday's assassination of Jean-Paul Marat. But this category is, maybe surprisingly, more limited than you might expect for such a violent period.
Right, it wasn't the dominant form.
No. Second, there was widespread popular violence or mob action. This refers to spontaneous or semi-organized mass killings perpetrated by large crowds. These acts were frequently fueled by deep-seated fear, rampant rumors, and perhaps most crucially, severe economic hardship.
Hunger and fear, a potent combination.
Absolutely. The September Massacres of 1792 stand as a chilling and pivotal example of this collective, often uncontrolled fury.
A truly terrifying moment.
And finally, the most terrifying and systematic form was state-sanctioned terror. This was a systematized political execution conducted by official government bodies, most notably the Revolutionary Tribunal, operating under formal legislative policy during what became known as the Reign of Terror.
So the state itself becomes the executioner.
Precisely. So you can already see how the very term assassin begins to stretch and blur, encompassing far more than a single individual acting alone. It becomes a mechanism of the state itself.
The assertion that violence is a factor, not an actor, is incredibly critical here because it fundamentally shifts our perspective. Instead of simply looking at individual perpetrators and their specific motives,
Which is often where we stop.
right, it compels us to understand the broader societal and political currents that gave rise to these actions and often shaped the very nature of those actions. It suggests that the agency wasn't solely with a specific individual assassin in a vacuum, but rather with the overarching revolutionary currents themselves, which created the conditions, the justifications, and even the mechanisms for such violence.
So the environment itself enables it.
In a profound way, yes. What's truly profound, and frankly quite terrifying, is how the state itself underwent a fundamental transformation during this period. As the revolution radicalized, particularly under Jacobin leadership, we see the government beginning to authorize and institutionalize the raw energy of popular violence.
Institutionalized mob violence. That sounds dangerous.
It was incredibly dangerous. Think about that. The raw, chaotic, often unpredictable energy of an angry mob, effectively harnessed, formalized, and directed by the government itself.
Wow.
We see this transition most clearly with the concept of terror. Initially, the term terror might have been a descriptive word for the prevailing atmosphere of fear and retribution.
Just describing the feeling on the streets.
Exactly. However, it progressively evolved into legalized terror, a policy of government. This is the paradox you alluded to earlier. The state, in its pursuit of order, control, and the stamping out of perceived enemies, effectively co-opted and formalized the very violence it might have initially sought to contain or suppress.
So it took over the violence.
It took what was once considered mob rule, often condemned as anarchy, and transformed it into a systematic state function, turning targeted political killing from an individual rogue act into a state-mandated policy, with legal frameworks and official bodies to enforce it.
Which is even scarier in a way.
It is. This historical trajectory reveals a dangerous pattern common in revolutionary movements. Initial popular uprisings, often spontaneous and driven by genuine grievances, are eventually channeled, formalized, and then ruthlessly applied by the governing power, leading directly to systematic repression and a profound erosion of fundamental rights. The initial liberating force of the people can become the oppressive machinery of the state.
And to truly grasp the scale and nature of this violence, we need to look at its roots. Was targeted violence against authority figures truly a new phenomenon in France, or did it have deeper precedents that perhaps set the stage for what was to come?
That's a really important question. It wasn't entirely out of the blue.
Consider instances like Robert-François Damien's assassination attempt on King Louis V in 1757, or even earlier, François Ravaillaac's successful attack on King Henry IV back in 1610.
Right. These attacks on the monarch happened before.
Damiens, a disgruntled servant influenced by critiques of the monarchy, attempted to harm the sacred body of the king. But his fate was, well, beyond gruesome.
Horrific, really.
He was subjected to public torture, his flesh torn by pincers, molten lead poured into his wounds, and finally he was drawn and quartered by horses before his remains were burned to ashes. This wasn't just punishment, it was a horrifying public spectacle, a visceral deterrent.
Designed to reinforce the king's divine status and the absolute inviolability of his person, the message was crystal clear. An attack on the king was an attack on God and the very order of the universe.
Make an example of them.
Precisely. The extreme brutality of Damien's and Ravaillaac's executions wasn't simply about vengeance. It was a deliberate theatrical act meant to reinforce the absolute, almost sacred nature of the monarch. The idea was to make any assault on the king literally unthinkable, a violation of not just human law but divine order.
But it happened anyway.
Exactly. The very fact that such attempts occurred and were etched into the collective memory suggests that the idea of eliminating a ruler, though taboo and punishable by horrific means, persisted beneath the surface of French society.
Interesting. So the idea was there, even if suppressed.
Then the revolution arrived, and with it, the monarchy underwent a profound process of desacralization. This process, which effectively defrocked the state of its sanctification by the clergy via the doctrine of divine right, fundamentally lowered the psychological and moral barrier to violence against authority figures.
The magic was gone.
You could say that. The old taboos, upheld by centuries of tradition and brutal deterrence, were shattered. When the revolution unleashed its own fury, it didn't create violence from a void. It drew upon a deeper, albeit suppressed, tradition of targeted political violence in France, which was then dramatically transformed and amplified by the new ideological landscape that legitimized actions against the very symbols of the old order.
So the past echoes into the revolution.
It does. The brutal suppressions of the past, intended to quash the idea of regicide, ironically served to remind people that the king could be touched, even if the consequences were dire.
So a foundation of sorts was already there. But the revolution cranked up the intensity to an entirely different level. The initial phase of the revolution itself was characterized by massive popular violence, often spontaneous and driven by incredibly deep grievances.
Things kicked off violently.
Think about the iconic storming of the Bastille on July 14, 1789. That wasn't just a symbolic act of defiance. It was a powerful, raw act of mob action, where the governor of the fortress was dragged through the streets and his head paraded on a pike.
A gruesome but powerful symbol.
But even before that, in 1788, 1789, we had urban revolts like the Réveillon riot in Paris, where hundreds were killed. What was often the constant catalyst for these explosions? Economic hardship.
Bread. It always seems to come back to bread.
The scarcity and soaring price of bread, in particular, which was the staple of the common diet, continually pushed citizens to riot, to storm market stalls, and tragically, even to engage in the desecration of noble bodies. Imagine the gnawing hunger, the desperation of trying to feed your family when the cost of bread, your basic sustenance, suddenly triples. It was truly a powder keg.
And that desperation is absolutely key. The pervasive economic chaos exacerbated by disastrous harvests and the rapid depreciation of the assignate currency, which was essentially paper money printed in vast quantities by the revolutionary government, quickly becoming nearly worthless, created an incredibly desperate and volatile populace.
Their money was becoming worthless.
Exactly. You had people living day to day, their meager savings evaporating, struggling simply to survive. This created a fertile ground for radicalization and scapegoating.
Someone had to be blamed.
And figures like Jean-Paul Marat and Jacques Hébert, influential journalists and politicians, skillfully channeled this economic frustration into targeted anger. They didn't just report the news, they weaponized the people's distress, pointing fingers at counter-revolutionary agents or hoarders who they claimed were deliberately withholding grain to starve the people and undermine the revolution.
So they directed the anger.
Absolutely. This inflammatory rhetoric accelerated revolutionary fervor and made extreme measures against perceived economic enemies seem not just acceptable, but absolutely necessary for the survival of the nation and its people. This raises an important question. How severe economic instability, coupled with the identification of convenient scapegoats, can serve as a powerful catalyst for political radicalization, turning legitimate social grievances into easily identifiable political targets and paving the way for brutal suppression.
A dangerous recipe. And this leads us directly to a critical escalation of popular violence. The September Massacres of 1792. This wasn't just a single incident, but 5 terrifying days of mass killings and summary executions that swept through Parisian prisons between September 2nd and 6th, 1792.
A truly dark chapter.
The numbers are truly chilling. Between, 11,176 and 1,614 individuals were killed.
It's hard to even grasp that scale of killing in just a few days.
And who were these victims? Approximately half of Paris's entire prison population. This included a significant proportion of non-political prisoners, common criminals, women, and even children, alongside hundreds of Catholic priests who had refused to swear allegiance to the new state.
So not just political enemies, it was indiscriminate in many ways.
Exactly. The perpetrators were largely sans-culottes, those working-class militants of Paris alongside the fédérés, volunteer soldiers from the provinces who had flocked to Paris, and even some National Guardsmen, ordinary people swept up in an extraordinary tide of fear and retribution.
The motivations for these massacres were multifaceted and incredibly complex. There was a widespread obsession with the perceived prison conspiracy, the fear that imprisoned royalists and refractory priests would break out and join advancing Prussian and royalist forces who were marching on Paris.
So, intense fear of a fifth column.
Absolutely. This was coupled with a deep-seated desire for revenge against perceived enemies of the revolution and, crucially, an overwhelming, almost existential fear of invasion and counter-revolution. This was a moment of profound national emergency for the revolutionaries.
Understandable fear, but the reaction.
The reaction was horrific, and what's particularly disturbing is the inaction, or perhaps, as one source describes it, the implicit condoning by revolutionary leaders like Georges Danton, who, despite holding significant power, did nothing to stop them.
He just let it happen.
Essentially, yes. This tacit acceptance effectively ushered in a new phase of the revolution, one where terror and extreme violence were no longer just spontaneous outbursts, but were openly considered legitimate political tools for achieving political ends and securing the revolution.
A turning point.
A definite turning point. This event demonstrated, in the most brutal way, that extreme violence could eliminate perceived internal threats. And most dangerously, it set a powerful, terrifying precedent for the more formalized, state-sanctioned reign of terror that was to come.
It connected the dots.
Right. Initial uncontrolled popular violence, if not condemned or checked, can become normalized and serve as a template for subsequent, more organized and ruthless state repression, especially when fear of external invasion provides a terrifying justification for turning inwards and rooting out perceived enemies.
And that brings us to the terrifying climax of state-sanctioned violence. The Reign of Terror, primarily from September 1793 to July 1794. This is a period of systematic political elimination on a truly horrific scale.
The peak of the institutionalized violence.
The numbers alone are staggering and hard to fully comprehend. An estimated 35,000 to 45,000 individuals were killed across France. Of those, 16,594 official death sentences were dispensed, with 2,639 of those executions taking place in Paris alone.
Thousands in Paris alone.
And chillingly, an additional 10,000 to 12,000 individuals were executed without trial. This systematic purge was not chaotic mob rule. It was orchestrated and controlled by the 12-man Committee of Public Safety, which effectively exercised near-dictatorial authority over France. It was a chilling example of revolutionary government wielding absolute power in the name of the people.
The rationalization for this period of intense violence by leaders like Robespierre is chilling indeed. They viewed it as a flawed but necessary response to the pressures of foreign war and domestic rebellion.
A necessary evil in their eyes.
That was the argument. The prevailing grim belief was that terror, at first an improvised response to defeat, once organized, became an instrument of victory. This was a cold, utilitarian logic. Extreme violence, systematically applied as a means to achieve the revolution's ideals and ensure national survival. It was seen as an unavoidable necessity to defend the Republic against a myriad of enemies.
And Robespierre, the incorruptible.
Robespierre famously declared that terror was nothing but prompt, severe, and flexible justice. He truly believed it was his duty to weed out those he believed could never possess this virtue, referring to the civic virtue he saw as essential for the Republic's success.
So violence became virtuous.
He fused political purity with violent elimination, elevating violence from a regrettable necessity to a moral imperative, making it a deliberate policy of government. This historical phenomenon illustrates a dangerous pattern: how revolutionary governments can rationalize and institutionalize extreme violence by framing it as absolutely essential for national security, ideological purity, and the achievement of a utopian vision.
The ends justify the means.
Exactly. It highlights the perilous interplay between lofty, abstract ideals and ruthless pragmatism in times of profound crisis, where the state believes it has not just a right, but a moral obligation to decide who lives and dies in the name of a greater good, blurring the lines between justice and arbitrary execution.
And the central judicial instrument of this state-sanctioned terror was the Revolutionary Tribunal, established in Paris by the National Convention. What's truly fascinating is its evolution.
How it changed over time.
Right. It was initially created in August 1792 to actually provide a formal legal process for political suspects, and importantly, to curb the kind of arbitrary killings seen during the September massacres. It was then reestablished in March 1793 with a permanent structure of judges, a public prosecutor, and a jury, all carefully selected from politically reliable activists. The initial idea was to bring some order to the chaos.
But that's not how it ended up, is it?
Not at all. And this is precisely where we see the insidious shift from its initial, more moderate purpose. Despite its foundational intention to provide due process, the tribunal's procedures increasingly bypassed standard legal norms. Defendants were systematically denied the right to appeal decisions, and crucially, they were often denied legal representation altogether.
Basic legal rights just disappeared.
Completely. Then came the infamous Law of 22 Prairial on June 10, 1794, which stripped defendants of any semblance of rights whatsoever. His law limited trials to a mere 3 days, prohibited witnesses, meaning no defense witnesses could be called, and offered only 2 verdicts: acquittal or death.
Acquittal or death, no middle ground.
None. This devastating piece of legislation effectively transformed the tribunal into an undiscriminating murder machine. It ushered in what became known as the Great Terror, where hundreds of heads fell daily. It was a grim procession, with a new batch of condemned arriving at the guillotine multiple times a day.
Just relentless killing.
What truly stands out here is how the legal system, ostensibly designed for justice and the rule of law, was systematically weaponized to consolidate power, eliminate dissent, and enforce ideological conformity. Fundamental rights were utterly sacrificed in the name of the revolution's survival, or its perceived ideological purity.
The conscience of the jurors, enlightened by the love of the fatherland, became the sole rule for judgment. replacing legal principles with political expediency, a truly chilling development that echoed far beyond France. Justice became whatever served the committee's immediate goals.
To bring this abstract discussion of violence to life, let's turn to a pivotal individual assassination that had massive repercussions: the killing of Jean-Paul Marat. He was a highly influential and incredibly polarizing figure during the Revolution.
You couldn't ignore Marat.
No. As the editor of his wildly popular newspaper, L'Ami du Peuple, or Friend of the People, he became notorious for his inflammatory rhetoric and fierce, often vitriolic, attacks on public officials and perceived enemies of the revolution.
He had a powerful pen, and he wasn't afraid to use it.
Marat consistently advocated for radical measures, including preventive actions against aristocrats and, chillingly, a greater application of the guillotine to ensure the Republic's survival. He tapped into the deep vein of public anger and resentment, becoming this powerful, almost singular voice, particularly among the poor, hungry, and marginalized segments of Parisian society.
He spoke their language, articulated their rage.
His immense popularity eventually secured him a seat in the powerful National Convention and a leadership role within the influential Jacobin Club, transforming him from a journalist to a powerful political force.
Marat's newspaper, L'Ami du Peuple, was far more than just a news outlet. It was a potent instrument of radicalization. It actively incited violence and, as another source puts it, helped fuel the violence of this troubled time. His virulent anti-clericalism and calls for a command economy, coupled with his virulent campaign against King Louis XVI, demonstrate how his words directly translated into popular action and intense political pressure.
His words had real consequences.
Absolutely. This highlights the critical role of charismatic figures and revolutionary media in shaping what our sources call the politics of exclusion and elimination. Marat's inflammatory language cultivated a pervasive fear of conspiracy, constantly warning of hidden enemies and plots against the revolution.
Always seeing plots and enemies?
He effectively demonized political opponents, portraying them not just as rivals but as traitors and parasites, creating an environment where violence against them was not only accepted but actively encouraged as a patriotic duty. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it illustrates how powerful rhetoric and propaganda, especially when amplified by a widely read publication, can be instrumental in radicalizing a populace, dehumanizing perceived enemies, and legitimizing extreme violence during periods of intense political instability. It's a chilling reminder of how words can incite bloodshed.
So on one side, we have Marat, the ultimate radical voice, relentlessly pushing for more extreme measures. And then we have his assassin, Charlotte Corday. She came from an aristocratic background, which is already a striking contrast.
An unlikely figure in some ways.
But she was a committed Republican and a staunch supporter of the more moderate Girondin faction.
So, a Republican, but a different kind.
Exactly. Her core belief was that Marat's radical views and violent rhetoric were utterly detrimental to France's future. She truly believed that his elimination was the sole means to preserve the revolution and prevent the escalating excesses of the Reign of Terror.
She saw him as the source of the problem.
She did. She even specifically held Marat responsible for the atrocities of the September massacres, seeing him as a bloodthirsty instigator. Her act was a deliberate, politically motivated assassination, conceived as a heroic sacrifice to rid France of what she saw as a bloodthirsty despot. She saw herself as a modern-day Brutus, striking down a tyrant for the good of the Republic.
Corday's act reveals a profound internal schism within the revolutionary movement itself. She perceived Marat not as a revolutionary hero, but as a functionary of ruin and a pestilence, a cancerous growth on the revolution. This case vividly highlights that even within the revolutionary camp, fundamental disagreements existed regarding the means to achieve revolutionary ideals.
They wanted the Republic, but disagreed violently on how to get there.
Precisely. While both Corday and Marat were Republicans, their visions for France and their tolerance for violence were diametrically opposed. Corday believed that eliminating Marat was a necessary, even virtuous act to preserve what she considered the true spirit of the revolution, one based on liberty and order, not endless bloodshed.
So it was revolutionaries killing revolutionaries.
Yes. This demonstrates how internal ideological conflicts led to internecine violence among former allies, a tragic pattern seen in many revolutions. The unity that had once been forged against the monarchy shattered, and now revolutionaries were turning on each other, each convinced their specific path was the only pure one, and that their opponents were not just mistaken, but actively destructive.
So on July 13, 1793, the iconic scene unfolds. Charlotte Corday gains entry to Marat's residence under the pretext of delivering crucial news regarding Girondin activities in Normandy.
A clever ruse to get access.
Marat, afflicted by a persistent skin condition that he often soothes in a medicinal bathtub, was actually conducting his work from there, writing fiery editorials.
Famously in his bath.
Corday then produced a kitchen knife from her dress and, in a swift, decisive movement, plunged it into his right side just below the clavicle. He cried out, "À moi, ma chère amie, à moi! To me, my dear friend, to me!" and then collapsed, bleeding profusely.
A shocking, intimate act of violence.
Corday made no attempt to flee, was immediately apprehended, offered no resistance to her fate, and was swiftly tried in guillotine just 4 days later. It was a remarkably swift and public act of retribution.
The profound symbolic power of this event cannot be overstated. Despite his immense public influence and radical image, Marat was ultimately accessible and vulnerable in his private space, highlighting that even the most powerful figures in a revolutionary climate could be personally targeted.
No one was truly safe.
And the intimate, almost domestic setting of the assassination Marat in his bathtub, engrossed in his work, became profoundly iconic, immortalized, as you mentioned, by Jacques-Louis David's famous painting, Death of Marat. This powerful artistic representation amplified the event's symbolic power, transforming Marat into a potent martyr for the Jacobin cause, a secular saint sacrificing himself for the revolution.
The painting is incredibly powerful.
It is. Corday's immediate and public execution also served as a swift, unequivocal demonstration of revolutionary justice, reinforcing the state's control and its decisive, ruthless response to perceived threats. This case, like others, shows that assassinations are not just acts of violence, they are highly symbolic events. Their immediate portrayal, the public reaction, and the subsequent treatment of the perpetrator become powerful tools for political messaging, shaping narratives and rallying support for or against a cause, often with profound and lasting cultural impact, dictating who becomes a hero and who a villain.
And here's the profound irony and the question that makes you pause and truly think. Corday's explicit intention was to stop the terror. She believed by eliminating Marat, she would cut out the cancerous heart of the escalating violence.
That was her stated goal.
So what does this all mean for the trajectory of the revolution?
Well, the outcome was completely the opposite of what she intended.
The paradoxical outcome was that Marat's death, tragically, instead gave the Jacobins a martyr who they could use to advance their agenda. What she hoped to prevent, she inadvertently accelerated, providing the very justification for the terror's expansion.
Absolutely. His assassination provided the Jacobins with an incredibly potent emotional narrative to justify continued purges and to consolidate their power, rallying Montagnard forces against the more moderate Girondins. It offered them the ultimate undeniable proof of a counter-revolutionary conspiracy, a dagger aimed at the very heart of the Republic.
They used his death perfectly for their own ends.
They did. This event allowed them to claim Marat as a heroic victim, a pure revolutionary sacrificed by the enemies of the people, demanding vengeance and further radicalization. Conversely, Charlotte Corday also became a symbolic figure, but for those who resisted the Jacobin regime. She was revered, particularly by counter-revolutionaries, as a modern-day Brutus, a heroic figure who had struck down a tyrant to save the Republic. Her image was celebrated by those who sought to discredit the Montagnards.
So both became symbols, but for opposing sides.
Exactly. This demonstrates a critical, unintended consequence of targeted political violence. Instead of de-escalating conflict or bringing about a desired political shift, it often provides a powerful pretext for further radicalization and retribution by the surviving faction. It fuels cycles of violence rather than ending them.
A terrible lesson.
It's a powerful and tragic example of how acts of political violence, even when intended to achieve specific, often noble outcomes, can paradoxically lead to the exact opposite, pushing a revolution towards greater extremism and a deeper cycle of bloodshed. The narrative control around such events becomes paramount, dictating not just the immediate future, but also the historical memory.
It's truly a heartbreaking lesson in unintended consequences. And this leads us to ask, what were the fundamental motivations and ideologies driving this systematic political elimination? How could a revolution founded on such idealistic and humanitarian projects as liberty, equality, fraternity, and the rights of man possibly descend into such widespread, systematic violence? Why did these noble ideals give way to such brutality?
That's the central chilling paradox of the French Revolution. Noble ideals, once they become abstract concepts like virtue, which was Robespierre's particular obsession and the bedrock of his political philosophy, or the general will as espoused by Rousseau, could be reinterpreted and weaponized to rationalize extreme measures.
Ideals twisted into weapons.
Precisely. The chilling belief emerged that if the ideology was the repository of the true and the good, then its enemies had to be exterminated without mercy because they stood in the way of this perfect vision
Anyone who disagreed was an obstacle to perfection.
and had to be removed. This made violence not just permissible, but a moral obligation to protect the revolution's purity or truth. Robespierre's relentless pursuit of virtue directly led to the continual push towards terror, as he saw it as his duty to purify the nation of all elements he deemed corrupt or unvirtuous.
Purity through purging.
This raises an important question about the inherent danger in revolutionary movements, where abstract ideals can be manipulated to justify extreme violence against anyone deemed to deviate from a prescribed ideological path, often leading to a form of ideological tyranny. The pursuit of a perfect society, in these contexts, often becomes the justification for atrocity, as those who disagree are no longer merely political opponents, but ideological traitors who threaten the very soul of the revolution.
And the violence wasn't just directed outward or at the remnants of the old regime. It was very much an internal war. We see this in the key rivalries that developed, particularly between the moderate Girondins, who often represented provincial interests and favored a more federalized republic.
And the radical Montagnards, largely composed of the Parisian bourgeoisie and sans-culottes, led by the influential Jacobin club. This was a battle for the very soul and direction of the revolution itself.
A power struggle within the revolution.
Absolutely. These factions engaged in a ruthless struggle for dominance, actively demonizing their rivals and employing Machiavellian forms of political and judicial manipulation to attack and destroy their rivals. This suggests a zero-sum political environment where compromise was perceived not as a strength, but as weakness or even outright treason against the revolution. Political battles became existential struggles.
You had to destroy your rivals to survive.
It seemed that way. The Jacobins, despite their dominance, saw enemies everywhere, both without and within. This pervasive suspicion, fueled by intense ideological purity tests, led to a brutal internal purging, where they systematically eliminated both moderate figures like Danton, who argued for less terror, and ultra-radical figures like Hébert, who argued for more.
So they attacked both sides.
Both the perceived too soft and the too extreme. This phenomenon illustrates how revolutionary periods frequently devolve into internal purges, where the struggle for power thus became a struggle for survival. It embodies the tragic reality of the revolution devouring its own children, as those who once fought side by side turn on each other in a desperate fight for control, often driven by ever-narrowing definitions of revolutionary loyalty.
Beyond ideology and factionalism, there was a constant, pervasive atmosphere of fear and paranoia that fueled the terror relentlessly. Revolutionary leaders and the populace alike were gripped by a profound sense of existential emergency.
The fear was palpable.
They faced widespread civil war across France, counter-revolutionary movements popping up in regions like the Vendée, and constant threats of foreign invasion. This was significantly exacerbated by things like the Brunswick Manifesto in 1792, which explicitly threatened to destroy Paris if the king was harmed. This external pressure created a perfect storm of internal suspicion.
This environment fostered constant suspicion of aristocratic plots and counter-revolutionary agents lurking everywhere. It created a toxic atmosphere of fear and mistrust that led to fervent calls for purification and a deep-seated belief that there is a conspiracy against public liberty.
Everyone suspected everyone else.
Pretty much. The law of suspects, for instance, which allowed for the arrest of anyone merely suspected of being counter-revolutionary, was a direct legislative response to this pervasive paranoia. It cast a wide net, ensnaring countless innocent citizens.
Just being suspected was enough.
We can trace a clear and dangerous feedback loop here. External threats and internal resistance generated intense, justified fear. This fear was then amplified and skillfully exploited by inflammatory rhetoric about conspirators and enemies in the press and from the podium. This amplified fear, in turn, justified increasingly repressive measures such as the law of suspects and the unchecked power of the Revolutionary Tribunal.
More fear leads to more repression.
Which then, paradoxically, created more suspects and victims, thereby reinforcing the initial paranoia. Robespierre's chilling logic, what is the remedy? to punish the traitors perfectly illustrates this self-perpetuating cycle. The toxic atmosphere of fear and distrust was not merely a backdrop, but an active ingredient, making violence a self-perpetuating cycle where repression was seen as the only means to combat an ever-growing, yet often imagined threat. It was a vicious circle of suspicion and retribution.
And we can't forget the foundational issues that fueled so much of this unrest: the severe and enduring socioeconomic pressures. Pre-revolutionary France was characterized by widespread poverty, escalating food prices, and disproportionately heavy taxation on the common populace, while the nobility and clergy enjoyed significant privilege and exemption.
The underlying inequality was huge.
This created deep-seated resentment and profound material hardship for the majority.
This pervasive economic chaos, combined with an inadequate policing infrastructure and a highly partisan judicial system, created an endemic state of violence that permeated daily life. The rapid depreciation of the assignate currency, that paper money we discussed earlier, and the persistent scarcity of affordable bread further exacerbated popular discontent, driving people to desperation.
Just a daily struggle to survive.
Imagine the daily struggle. Waking up unsure if you'd find bread, or if the money you earned yesterday would be worth anything today. What's fascinating here is how radical politicians and journalists skillfully exploited this hardship. They blamed counter-revolutionary agents or hoarders for the people's suffering,
Finding scapegoats again?
arguing that these traitors were deliberately causing scarcity to undermine the revolution. This political framing of economic issues transformed legitimate social grievances into identifiable political targets, making violence against these enemies seem like a direct and necessary solution to material problems.
Solving hunger with executions.
It sounds absurd, but that was the implication. This phenomenon highlights how profound economic distress, when coupled with shrewd political agitation and the identification of clear scapegoats, can become a powerful and destructive force driving widespread and often brutal political violence, blurring the lines between legitimate social protest and targeted, politically sanctioned elimination. It shows how easily human desperation can be weaponized.
So who are the perpetrators in all of this? Were these assassins a distinct, shadowy group operating entirely outside of mainstream society, or something far more pervasive? Our sources show us it was truly a diverse spectrum of agents, blurring the lines of responsibility.
It wasn't just one type of person.
No. For instance, the September massacres were carried out by sans-culottes, those working-class militants of Paris, alongside fédérés, volunteer soldiers from the provinces, and even National Guardsmen. While some descriptions call the sans-culottes society's dregs, the violence wasn't limited to the poor.
Right, it cut across classes.
We also saw revolutionary officials, judges, and even public prosecutors of the Revolutionary Tribunal actively involved in condemning thousands to death. And the Jacobin Club, which provided much of the ideological and organizational leadership for the terror, largely comprised middle and professional classes: lawyers, doctors, journalists, and merchants. This wasn't just the fringes of society, it was woven into its very fabric.
This varied involvement from peasants and artisans, professionals, business owners, and nobles to specific groups like the sans-culottes indicates that revolutionary violence was not confined to a single social stratum or a distinct assassin archetype. Instead, it permeated the entire social fabric, demonstrating a shocking elasticity in who could become a perpetrator.
Anyone could become involved.
It seems so. The transition from spontaneous mob actions to formalized state-sanctioned executions reveals a dangerous continuum. Individuals who participated in popular violence could later become agents of state terror. Take Georges Danton, for example, whose role in the insurrectionary commune and his tacit acceptance of the September massacres illustrate this evolution from a popular leader to a figure complicit in state violence.
From street leader to state figure.
This suggests that the life of assassins was not a distinct subculture, but rather a manifestation of how ordinary people, driven by ideology, intense fear, and extraordinary circumstance, could become agents of political elimination, whether through individual acts, collective mob action, or as functionaries of the state apparatus. This fundamentally challenges the notion of assassins as isolated rogue figures, revealing instead a broader societal embrace of violence as a political tool, where individuals from surprisingly diverse backgrounds could become perpetrators within a system that legitimized and even demanded their actions.
Imagine living in Paris during this period, especially under the full swing of the Reign of Terror. Our sources describe daily life as profoundly chaotic and uncertain, dominated by a pervasive atmosphere of fear and repression.
Just constant anxiety.
You might hear a knock on your door late at night, knowing it could be the Revolutionary Committee. A loose comment at the market, a forgotten aristocratic acquaintance, or simply not displaying enough civic virtue could be enough. Accusations of disloyalty, often based on flimsy evidence, could swiftly lead to imprisonment or execution.
Living on a knife edge.
An extreme paranoia regarding counter-revolutionaries, both internal and external, permeated every aspect of society. And the sheer frequency of public executions reaching up to 800 a month in Paris during the peak of the Great Terror led to a chilling desensitization to violence among the average citizen. The sight of the guillotine, once shocking, became disturbingly routine.
It wasn't just about the direct threat, it was complete reshaping of society's psychological landscape. The constant threat of accusation, imprisonment, and execution, coupled with widespread paranoia and suspicion, created a pervasive sense of insecurity that deeply impacted individual and collective psychology. The sheer frequency of public executions led to a disturbing desensitization to brutality,
People just got used to it.
indicating a profound psychological adaptation to the violence. People learned to live with the omnipresent shadow of the guillotine, which must have fundamentally altered their perception of life and death. This environment was not merely a passive backdrop, it actively shaped behavior. It compelled individuals to outwardly demonstrate patriotism, even if forced, to avoid suspicion and denunciation.
You had to look patriotic.
Absolutely. Traditional references to Catholicism and royalty were systematically replaced, streets were renamed, the calendar was changed to a revolutionary one, and even dress codes evolved, with the tricolor cockade becoming a mandatory sign of revolutionary allegiance. The toxic atmosphere of fear and mistrust became the default mode of existence.
It changed everything.
What truly stands out to you about how prolonged state terror can reshape a society's psychological landscape, turning forced conformity and outward displays of loyalty into a fundamental survival mechanism? It's a profound transformation of human nature under duress.
And hand in hand with the violence was the relentless manipulation of public reaction through propaganda. Reactions to assassinations and executions were highly politicized and actively manipulated for propaganda purposes.
Controlling the narrative was key.
Marat's death, for example, was immediately leveraged by the Jacobins to rally support and advance their agenda, portraying him as a revered martyr who died for the revolution. Conversely, Charlotte Corday was swiftly depicted as a heroic figure by counter-revolutionaries, a modern-day Brutus who had bravely struck down a tyrant. Both sides constructed their own narratives around the same event.
The same event, two completely different stories.
Exactly.
The Revolutionary Tribunal and the guillotine itself were explicitly designed not just as tools of execution, but as examples of spectacular violence to show the strength of the revolutionary government and intimidate counter-revolutionary opponents. These were public spectacles, not hidden acts, designed to send a clear message. This systematic manipulation of public perception demonstrates that in revolutionary periods, the control of narrative,
Who tells the story?
the power to define who is a hero and who is a villain, whose death is a sacrifice, and whose is a justified elimination becomes as crucial as the physical acts of violence themselves. Government propaganda was actively employed to disseminate state-favored views and demonize enemies of the people through pamphlets, newspapers, and public speeches.
The media played a huge role.
A massive role. The intense debate over the revolution's heroes and villains, and the portrayal of revolutionaries by their detractors as barbarians, bloodthirsty savages, began as early as the 1790s. This highlights how narratives are deliberately constructed around political violence, profoundly shaping collective memory and the historical understanding of the period long after the events themselves have passed. Control of the story is, in essence, control of the past and a powerful lever for the future.
We've journeyed through the complexities of violence in revolutionary Paris, from the nuanced definitions of what assassin truly meant in this context, to the deep historical roots of targeted violence, its terrifying institutionalization through state terror, and its profound transformative impact on individuals and society.
It's been quite a journey.
We've seen that the life of assassins was not a distinct, shadowy subculture, but deeply woven into the very fabric of the revolution, a manifestation of how ordinary people could become agents of political elimination in extraordinary times.
And the core takeaway from this deep dive is stark and clear. The French Revolution demonstrates, in vivid and often brutal detail, how a society grappling with immense political, economic, and ideological shifts can descend into a self-perpetuating cycle of violence.
Dangerous cycle.
It shows us that noble ideals, when combined with intense factionalism, pervasive fear, and economic desperation, can be twisted to justify extreme measures, leading to the systematic elimination of perceived enemies and the erosion of fundamental rights. The assassins of this era were not merely isolated figures, but products and agents of a revolutionary culture that normalized and institutionalized political death as a means to an end.
So the final thought for you, our listener.
What does this deep dive into revolutionary Paris tell us about the warning signs when any society, in its passionate pursuit of purity or security, starts to sacrifice fundamental rights and normalize violence as a means to an end? How do we recognize that slippery slope in our own context when the language of virtue or necessity begins to justify the dehumanization of those who disagree?